Well, now back to the Ten Commandments, the laws that God gave the children of Israel. Those laws that God gave the children of Israel, don't worry right now about whether we're subject to those laws. Just think about this. What do those laws teach us about God? What kind of a God would make such requirements of His people? I have another lesson I want to teach sometime about we need a new God. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of the laws that God gave His people, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, are just not the type of laws that people want today. And so people want a new God that'll give them a new set of laws, different set of values. We're going to see that some even as we're looking at it tonight. And the main thing I want to do as we look at these Ten Commandments is just ask the question of each one, now what kind of God would make a law like that? What does this law teach us about God? And the more we think about that, the more we'll come to understand what not just those Ten Commandments are about, but what God is like. And we'll find it makes it really fairly easy to see how we relate to these same moral principles and laws that God gave today. All right, let's take the very first one by way of illustration. The first commandment, the first thing God told His people. And I want to tell you, this is not something people would like to hear today. He says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Today people would like to hear a God that would say, you can worship me, but, I don't want to monopolize all your time. And, there are lots of good things that you might, like to experience out there in the world. So if you get time to drop by and worship me, that would be fine. But if there's something else that you'd like to do, well, I understand. Don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable. Don't want to suggest that some of the other gods are not true gods. Far be it from me to embarrass anybody or put anybody on the spot. That's the type of thing that people would like to hear today. But the God that gave these Ten Commandments, and remember, it's the same God that gave His Son to die on the cross for our sins as well. It's the very same God we were praying to just a short while ago. The God that gave these commandments, the first thing He said when He opened His mouth to the children of Israel is, "Don't you dare serve anybody else. You shall have no other gods before me." Not even, a sort of I'm glad to meet you, let's talk. Don't serve anybody else. Now, what does that tell you about? What type of God would say such a thing? And I suspect one of the phrases that probably comes to a lot of your minds, even as we say that, this is a jealous God. Somebody might say, this God's got a problem. Well, that'd be the idea of a lot of people in our society today. But that is the nature of God. He is a God who demands everything from us. He is a God that is intolerant of other gods, of false gods, of everything that we might put in front of Him. He's not a wishy-washy God. Take it or leave it. If it feels good, I can help you. He is a demanding God and an intolerant God for those who would turn away from Him and reject Him. And I think that very first commandment teaches us that in no uncertain terms. That's who we are praying to. The second commandment. The second commandment is often confused with the first commandment, but they're quite different. They're often confused in our mind because we associate idolatry with pagan polytheism. We say the people that make idols are the people that worship false gods, and the people that worship false gods worship many gods. Well, that's generally true. But there, in fact, are other issues. The first commandment addresses the issue of polytheism. Is there one God or many gods? And God says, actually, He doesn't even say, I'm the only God there is. He just says, I'm the only God to be worshipped. And you don't even have to sort out whether there are any other gods or not. I'm the only one you serve. The fact is, people have always made other gods. Whether they were real or had any power or not, He still says, I'm the only one you serve. The second commandment, though, deals not with whether or not there are many gods or one God. The second commandment deals with whether or not you make an image of God. Whether you try to make something to represent that God. And so, He says, you shall not make for yourself an idol. The King James Version says a graven image, but that's one way of describing what an idol is. A material thing made to represent the god, and often made in the likeness of something that we know. As he says, don't make yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and so forth. What does this teach us about God? When he says, you don't make any image, no idol. And that would apply not just to an idol of Baal, that would apply to an idol of Jehovah. Don't make any image, even if you're just going to worship me. Don't make an image to do that. Well, one of the things that suggests to me, one of the things I think that teaches me about God is that God is spirit. He's not some material thing in this world. And the fact of the matter is, all of the pagan nations around Israel believed that. Oh, they would say their gods were spirits too. I mean, they would use that type of a term. But ultimately, their gods were all part of this material universe. The storm god was the storm. And the saltwater god was the salt water. And the fire god was the fire. And the sun god was the sun. But God was not like any of those gods. He was not a God that was part of this world and could be represented by things in this world and even controlled by things in this world. That often went along with the idea of an idol. The typical pagan didn't really believe that the image was the sum total of the god. I mean, they knew there was an image of Baal in this temple and an image of Baal in that temple and an image of Baal in another temple. And so they didn't think that the little bronze statue or gold statue that they might have that represented Baal, they didn't think that that was actually Baal right there. They understood that much, but they believed that that had the power of Baal in it, the force of Baal in it, and if you could control that image, you could control Baal. And because they believed their gods were tied to this whole material world, very much like this modern, there's an awful lot of paganism in the world around us today. There are these spirit forces in nature that somehow you have to get in tune with and things like that. That's pure pagan philosophy. And that's exactly the way they thought and the way they understood. And God says, I'm not like that. You don't make any image of me. God is spirit. The third commandment, verse 7. The third commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Now, a word about what it meant to take God's name in vain. We most commonly use that expression today. When somebody links the name of God with profanity, either in a full form or a short form. They may or may not say the profane word, but they will cry out, and that's what we commonly say is taking the Lord's name in vain. Well, that certainly is taking the Lord's name in vain. But that's probably not the type of taking the Lord's name in vain. One might say that's an even lower form of taking the Lord's name in vain than perhaps what is in mind right here. If you look through the Old Testament and references to taking God's name in vain, you'll find that that expression is most commonly used in connection with taking an oath in the name of God and lying. And in other words, you have sworn by Jehovah, but you were lying. Now, why is that taking God's name in vain? Well, God is holy, and you're committing a sin. And what you're doing is you're dragging God's name into your sinful mess. You know, we sometimes say, don't drag my name into that. There are certain things we don't want our name associated with. There might be people or behaviors that we don't want our name associated with. And we would consider it an insult to us to have our name associated with that. Well, how does God feel when we drag His name into our sinful behavior? That's really, more than anything else, what taking God's name in vain is. And it profanes His name. it desecrates it. It takes that which is holy and it treats it as profane, as sinful, as corrupt. And when we invoke God's name over our sinful behavior, then that's taking God's name in vain. And it is a lack of respect for His holiness, for His purity. And I would suggest that's what that commandment teaches us about God. Many of the pagan deities had enough sinful behavior of their own and were involved in all sorts of moral activities. They might still reproach men every once in a while for doing it in the myths of the pagans, but God was holy. God is holy. And this commandment, I think, teaches us something about His holiness and His separation from sin. And at the same time, teaches us something about our sinfulness and our unholiness.